Welcome back, friends. Tonight we find ourselves somewhere cold. Not the polite cold of a drafty apartment or a forgotten jacket, but the kind of cold that medieval people had a name for a fear of and a whole religion trying to make sense of. We're standing inside a stone castle somewhere in the English countryside in the year 1280, and the walls around you are not just walls. They are the accumulated cold of centuries pressed into limestone and mortar, exhaling winter from every surface. Your breath hangs in the air like a small ghost before fading into the darkness above. The rushes beneath your feet whisper as you shift your weight. The fire across the hall has burned low, and somewhere in this building 30 people are about to wake up and begin the slow, exhausting negotiation with cold that defines every single day of their lives. You would not survive a week here, not without a body conditioned by years of labour, a stomach accustomed to food that is fuel rather than pleasure, and a tolerance for cold so deep it has become something like a second skin. Now, if this is your first time here, take a moment to subscribe. And if you've been with me for a while, you already know the deal. No alarm clocks in this world, just hit find your most comfortable position, and let's go. And tell me, where are you tonight? What does your world sound like right now? Now close your eyes, let your shoulders drop, and imagine yourself waking up inside a medieval castle on the coldest morning of the year. The castle has no name you would recognise. It was recorded in a survey once 2 decades ago, described in Latin as a fortified residence of moderate size garrisoned by a lord of middling ambition and substantial cold. That last part was not in the survey. But it should have been. Because the cold here is not incidental. It is structural. It is architectural. It was built in stone by stone before anyone fully understood what they were constructing. A fortress against human enemies, yes, but entirely defenceless against January. You are a servant. This matters enormously in the world of 1280 because your entire experience of winter will be shaped by this single fact. You're not the lord who sleeps in the solar, the private upper chamber where a fireplace was installed 3 years ago at considerable expense and even more considerable pride. You're not the lady whose handmaiden banks the fire through the night and whose fur-lined blankets represent a small fortune in pelts. You are the person who makes those fires possible. You are the one who carries the wood, the one who hauls the coal from the undercroft, the one who wakes before the household and ensures that when the family rises, warmth is already waiting for them like a gift they never had to ask for. Your name is not in any record. This is simply how it was. The Lord's accounts mention quantities of firewood, amounts of tallow costs of wool, but not the hands that carried these things through frozen corridors before the sun had any interest in rising. You're in the language of history anonymous. But you are here. You are cold. And you are against considerable odds alive. The great hall where you spent the night is beginning to show its first movements. The central hearth, a large open fire pit built directly into the floor, has burned down to embers that glow like something tired and stubborn. Around it, in rough concentric rings of privilege, people and animals are stirring. The hounds closest to the heat lift their heavy heads and lower them again. A young groom rolls onto his side, disturbing the straw beneath him with a sound like something breathing. Across the room, near the screen's passage, a group of kitchen workers are already rising. With the quiet efficiency of people who have done this so many times, it no longer requires thought. A curious detail historians love to mention, the word comfort, which we use so casually today, carried a different weight in the medieval period. It derived from the Latin comfortare, to strengthen, to fortify. Comfort was not softness, it was resilience. To be comforted was to be made capable of enduring. When medieval people sought comfort from the cold, they were not seeking luxury. They were seeking the minimum conditions necessary to continue functioning. This distinction matters as you watch the servants rise in the pre-dawn dark, pulling rough wool around their shoulders, not with the gesture of someone reaching for a blanket, but with the deliberate movement of someone putting on equipment. There is still scholarly debate about the precise temperatures inside medieval great halls during winter. Some researchers suggest that a well-maintained central fire in an enclosed hall could keep interior temperatures hovering around 10 to 12 degrees Celsius, even on the coldest nights uncomfortable by modern standards, survivable by medieval ones. Others point to accounts of ink freezing in monastery scriptorium, of wine solidifying in great house cellars, of priests recording that their fingers were too numb to hold the quill. The range of experience was vast, but the baseline was always the same. Cold was the condition and everything else was a response to it. The corridor beyond the hall is a different world entirely. Here there is no hearth glow, no body warmth accumulated from sleeping forms, no dogs radiating quiet heat into the surrounding air. There is only stone and darkness and a cold so direct it feels almost personal. You place your hand against the wall and pull it back immediately. The stone is not merely cold, it is aggressively cold. Cold in the way that reminds you it has been this temperature since before your grandfather was born and will remain this temperature long after you're gone. You move toward the kitchen passage. Ahead, a faint orange line beneath a door tells you the fire is already lit, that someone arrived before you, that the day has already begun its slow argument with the dark. You follow the light. You always follow the light. The great hall's fire is behind you now, and ahead the kitchen door breathes warmth into the corridor like a living thing. You push it open and step inside, and the change is immediate, not comfortable, not warm in any modern sense of the word, but survivable, in a way the rest of the castle is not. The kitchen is the one room in this entire stone fortress where winter loses its absolute authority, where cold is merely a visitor rather than a permanent resident. You stand in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, letting the relative warmth settle around you like something borrowed. The kitchen is already occupied. It is always already occupied. The cook, a broad woman named, let us say, Agnes, because Agnes appears in more medieval household records than almost any other name has been awake since before you, which is saying something considering you woke before the sun had any interest in rising. She is standing at the central preparation table, her sleeves rolled despite the temperature, her hands moving with the automatic efficiency of someone who has performed these exact motions approximately 10,000 times. A pot hangs over the fire on an iron crane, its contents already beginning to stir. The smell hits you before anything else oats water. The faint sweetness of a heel of old bread dropped in for body. Pottage, again, always pottage. But this morning, on this particular frozen January day, pottage smells like salvation. Agnes does not smile before the pottage is ready. Nobody in this castle is brave enough to test whether she ever has. Here is something worth understanding about the medieval kitchen. It was not merely a room where food was prepared. It was the thermal engine of the entire household. The fire here burned longer, hotter and more consistently than any other fire in the castle. It had to. A kitchen fire that died meant no breakfast, no dinner, no hot water for the lord's morning wash, no warmed wine for the lady's afternoon, no heated stones for the beds at night. Everything downstream of warmth in this household traced its origins back to this room, this hearth, this fire that Agnes had been managing since before most of the current servants were born. A quirky detail that medieval food historians tend to enjoy in many large households. The kitchen fire was technically never fully extinguished. It was banked at night, pushed to the back of the hearth, covered with ash to slow its breathing. But the intention was always continuity rather than extinction. Some kitchen fires in great houses reportedly burned for decades without being completely put out, existing as a kind of perpetual institution passed from one cook to the next like an inheritance. Whether this is entirely literal or somewhat embellished by the romance of repetition, the underlying point stands. Fire was not switched on and off. Fire was tended, maintained, and respected as something precious and semi-permanent. You find your position in the kitchen's hierarchy quickly, because in a medieval household, everyone knows their position, and deviating from it causes a friction that nobody has the energy for before sunrise. You are not Agnes. You're not even Agnes's direct assistant. You're one of the general servants whose morning kitchen duties involve carrying, fetching, washing, and staying out of the way of people who actually know what they're doing. This last item is in practice the most demanding of the three. You take a bucket iron heavy, its handle cold enough to sting even through your rough wool wrap, and head toward the water supply. This is where winter makes its first direct intervention in your morning. The water barrel near the kitchen door, which is filled daily from the castle's well, has a thin crust of ice across its surface. Not thick, not the solid freezing you will encounter at the outdoor troughs, but enough to require breaking with your fist before you can dip the bucket. The ice cracks with a sound like a small complaint, and the water beneath is so cold it makes your hand ache instantly. You fill the bucket, carry it to Agnes, and go back for another. This will happen 6 or 7 more times before the household fully wakes. Agnes receives each bucket with the acknowledgement of someone who expected it to arrive, and would have had opinions if it had not. There is still debate among historians about how medieval castles actually managed their water supply in winter. Some larger fortresses had internal well systems protected from the worst of the freezing by the castle's own mass. Others relied on external sources, rivers, rainwater cisterns, communal village wells that were genuinely inaccessible during hard freezes. The records that survive suggest a pragmatic improvisation. Ice was melted when necessary, snow was gathered when available, and the rationing of water for washing and cleaning became considerably more aggressive during the coldest months. The lord still washed. The servants made do. These two facts existed in the household accounts side by side without apparent awareness of their irony. Agnes does not speak to you directly this morning. She rarely does before the pottage is ready, and now you understand why nobody rushes the pottage. Communication in the pre-dawn kitchen is mostly gesture and precedent. You know what needs doing because it needed doing yesterday and the day before and will need doing tomorrow. And this reliable sameness is its own form of instruction. Someone younger than you, a boy of perhaps 12, thin in the way that suggests a summer without quite enough food, is blowing carefully on the fire's lower edge, coaxing it from its overnight banking into the full morning burn. His face is very close to the flames. The warmth on his cheeks is visible even from across the room, a faint ruddiness spreading over features that were grey with cold a moment ago. You watch him for a moment. There is something almost tender about the sight, a child and a fire, the oldest partnership in human history. Historians who study medieval childhood sometimes point to the kitchen as one of the few places where a young servant's life had genuine physical comfort built into its structure. The work was hard, the hours were long, and the hierarchy was strict, but the kitchen was warm, and warmth in the world of 1280 was the closest thing available to kindness. The pottage begins to bubble. Agnes stirs it once authoritatively in the manner of someone reminding a pot who is in charge. The smell thickens, rises, fills the room with something that is not quite pleasant by modern standards, but is deeply essentially right for this morning, this cold, this hunger. Around you, the kitchen begins its full awakening. More servants arriving, more tasks beginning the machinery of the household cranking into its daily motion. Outside, the sky is still black. The frost is still absolute. The castle's stone is still exhaling cold into every corridor and chamber. But here in this kitchen, with its perpetual fire and its bubbling pot, and its small army of half-awake servants, winter has been pushed back to the walls. Agnes stirs the pottage a second time. Still not ready, you have learned not to ask. For now that is enough. The pottage is not ready yet. It will not be ready for another hour, and you have learned through the particular education of hunger and consequence that asking Agnes about the pottage before it is ready produces a look that is somehow colder than the corridor you just walked through. So you leave the kitchen's warmth with the reluctance of someone stepping back into water they know is too cold, and you make your way toward the great hall. This is the room that will occupy the centre of your day, the gravitational heart of the castle's social and thermal universe. In the summer, the great hall is merely a large room. In winter, it becomes something closer to a philosophy. It is the medieval answer to the question of how human beings survive together, when the alternative is freezing separately, and the answer it offers is both practical and surprisingly intimate. The hall is long and high-ceilinged, which is architecturally impressive and thermally catastrophic. Heat rises. This is a fact of physics that medieval builders understood imperfectly and experienced acutely. The central hearth, positioned roughly in the middle of the rush-strewn floor, sends most of its warmth directly upward toward a ceiling that has no interest in returning it. The result is a room with a warm middle and brutally cold edges, a gradient of temperature that maps almost exactly onto the social hierarchy of those who sleep within it. The people nearest the fire are the most important people permitted to sleep in the hall. The people farthest from it are the least. Cold in this room is not merely a physical condition. It is a statement about your value. You begin your first task of the morning, which is the rushes. The floor of the great hall is covered with a deep layer of dried rushes, reeds and grasses cut in late summer, and spread across the flagstones as both insulation and floor covering. In the grandest households, sweet-smelling herbs were mixed in lavender meadow, sweet chamomile, and the accounts of visiting dignitaries occasionally mention the pleasant fragrance of a well-maintained floor. In a household of middling means in January, the rushes smell primarily of dog smoke and the compressed memory of many previous nights. They are, however, genuinely warm underfoot. The flagstones beneath them are stone cold, and the rushes, sometimes packed several inches deep, create a meaningful buffer between the living and the floor's ambient temperature. This is not luxury. This is engineering. A curious detail that historians of medieval domestic life tend to find charming. There is ongoing scholarly discussion about exactly how often the rushes in a medieval great hall were changed. Popular imagination suggests they were replaced rarely and allowed to accumulate layers of debris food scraps and worse over months or even years. Some medieval sources do describe filthy floors with evident disgust, suggesting this was a recognised problem rather than an accepted norm. Other records indicate regular replacement, particularly in households with strong organisational management. The truth appears to have varied enormously. What is consistent is that the rushes represented a genuine investment of labour. Cutting, drying, transporting and spreading them was a significant task, and so they were not discarded lightly. You sweep the edges of the hall first, moving the night's accumulated debris bone fragments dropped by the dog's ash that has drifted from the hearth, the general litter of a room that served as dining hall, reception space and dormitory simultaneously. The broom in your hands is a bundle of birch twigs tied tight, its handle worn smooth by years of identical mornings. The rhythm of sweeping is almost meditative, a back-and-forth motion that warms your arms slightly without warming your feet at all. The cold rises from the flagstones beyond the rushes like something patient. It is not aggressive this morning, not the sharp assault of the open corridor. It is simply present, reliable, reminding you of its permanent tenancy. As you work, the hall fills gradually. This is one of the things about medieval castle life that modern descriptions sometimes miss: the sheer density of human habitation. The Great Hall was not an empty ceremonial space punctuated by occasional gatherings. It was a lived-in room occupied almost continuously, its population shifting and overlapping throughout the day. Servants moved through it on errands. Household knights ate their meals at its lower tables. Dogs circulated with the confidence of animals who understood their social position. And in winter, the number of people spending their nights here increased because the Great Hall's central fire represented the most efficient use of communal warmth available. Body heat is an underappreciated factor in medieval thermal management. A single human body at rest generates roughly the same heat as a 60-watt light bulb, a fact that medieval people understood instinctively even without the vocabulary to articulate it. 30 people sleeping in a large hall do not merely share the fire's warmth, they contribute their own. The collective warmth of a hall full of sleeping servants and household staff was a meaningful addition to the night's thermal budget, which is part of why sleeping arrangements that would seem bizarre or intrusive by modern standards were simply practical by medieval ones. You did not sleep alone if you could avoid it. Shared warmth was common sense dressed up as custom. The tapestries help too. Along the hall's longer walls hang several large woven hangings, not primarily decorative, though they are decorated, but fundamentally functional. They create a layer of insulation between the stone wall and the inhabited space, trapping a thin envelope of warmer air against their inner surface. Running your hand along the edge of one now, you feel the difference immediately. The side facing you is merely cool. The side against the wall is stone cold. The tapestry is doing real work quietly without acknowledgement. A philosophical thought arrives without invitation. The way they tend to on cold mornings. There is something generous about the medieval Great Hall that the modern world has largely abandoned. The lord and his household did not sleep in sealed private chambers entirely separated from their servants. They shared this space, this air, this fire. Not equally, never equally, but together. The hierarchy of warmth was real, but so was the shared condition of cold. Everyone here knew what January felt like. Everyone here understood what the fire meant. The hearth glows steadily, now rebuilt from its overnight banking into a proper morning fire. Its warmth reaches you in waves, retreating and returning with each draft from the shuttered windows. You lean toward it for just a moment, holding your palms out, feeling the heat press against your skin. The hall is waking up around you. Another day inside, the cold stone has begun. Somewhere in this castle there is a boy who did not sleep last night. Not properly, not in the way that restores a person, and sends them into the morning feeling like themselves. He slept the way a sailor sleeps in a storm, in fragments, in flinches, one part of his mind, always listening, always monitoring, always aware of the one thing he could not allow to happen. His name is probably Thomas. Thomas appears in medieval household records with the frequency of a word that language cannot do without. He is perhaps 10 years old, perhaps 11 small for his age, in the way that children who have never had quite enough food tend to be small, and his job, his entire reason for existing within this household's economy is the fire, Not the kitchen fire Agnes owns, that one with a territorial certainty that discourages all intervention. Not the fires in the Lord's Solar or the Ladies' Chamber, those belong to personal servants of higher rank and longer service. Thomas's fire is the great hall hearth, the central open pit that is simultaneously the most important fire in the building and the most technically demanding to maintain through a winter night. It is important because it heats the space where the majority of the household sleeps. It is demanding because an open central hearth, unlike a walled fireplace, loses heat in every direction, simultaneously consumes fuel at a rate that requires careful management and must be banked, reduced to a controlled slow burn during the deepest hours of the night without being allowed to die entirely. This distinction between banking and dying is the central anxiety of Thomas's existence. A banked fire is intentional. It is a fire breathing slowly, conserving itself, waiting. The technique involves pushing the larger burning logs to the back of the hearth, raking the hot coals into a dense central pile and covering them with a thick layer of ash, the ash acting as an insulating blanket that slows combustion without extinguishing it. Done correctly, a banked fire can sustain itself for 6 to 8 hours, producing minimal light and minimal heat, but maintaining the crucial ember core from which a full morning fire can be rebuilt with relative speed. Done incorrectly, the ash layer too thin, the coal pile too scattered, the logs positioned poorly, the fire simply fades. The embers cool, the ash goes grey and dead. And Thomas wakes to a hall that has been surrendering its warmth to the winter for hours. Here is what happened to servants who let the fire die, not violence usually, not dramatic punishment, simply the flat, heavy disappointment of people who understood exactly what a dead fire meant in practical terms. Cold breakfast, cold water. A lord who woke to a chamber that had dropped several degrees overnight because the hall fire that indirectly warmed the floor above it had failed. A household that began its day 2 hours behind schedule because the kitchen fire, which drew its overnight banking coals from the hall hearth, also needed relighting from scratch. The consequences radiated outward from that single failed fire like rings in cold water, and everyone felt them, and everyone knew whose responsibility it had been. Historians still debate the specific role of child servants in medieval fire management. Some researchers argue that the positioning of young servants near the hearth overnight was essentially a fire-watching function, a human alarm system supplementing the banked fire's own uncertain reliability. Others suggest that the presence of children near fires at night was more incidental, simply a reflection of the hall's sleeping arrangements, and that fire management was the responsibility of more senior servants who checked the hearth during their own natural night wakings. What the records do confirm is that fire maintenance was a defined household responsibility, that its failure had real consequences, and that the person assigned to it carried a weight disproportionate to their age or status. Thomas is awake now, crouched at the hearth's edge with a long iron poker, carefully rebuilding the fire from its banked state into something worthy of a morning. He works with a concentration that is almost painful to watch, each log placed with deliberate precision, each adjustment of the poker calculated rather than impulsive. The embers respond slowly, as embers do, glowing brighter as he coaxes air toward them, darkening when he moves the poker too quickly and disturbs their rhythm. There is a conversation happening here between the boy and the fire, conducted entirely without words. He has been having this conversation every night for 2 winters. He has learned the fire's language. He knows when it is willing and when it is stubborn. This morning it is willing. You watch him work and feel something that is not quite pity and not quite admiration, but sits somewhere between them. He's doing something genuinely skilled. The management of fire, real fire, not the controlled domestic fire of a modern fireplace, but the open, variable, weather-sensitive fire of a medieval hall hearth, requires an understanding of combustion, airflow, fuel quality, and timing that takes years to develop. Thomas has developed it through the most direct education available, which is the education of cold consequences. He has been cold because of a fire he mismanaged. He will not mismanage it again. A small quirky footnote from medieval household accounts: in some larger establishments, the overnight firekeeper was permitted a specific additional food ration, an extra portion of bread or a cup of ale, as compensation for the disrupted sleep that the role required. This appears in the accounts matter-of-factly listed alongside other functional expenses, which suggests it was understood as a genuine professional consideration rather than a luxury. Someone in medieval estate management had done the calculation: a well-fed firekeeper who stays awake is cheaper than the consequences of a dead hall fire in January. The math was simple. The humanity of it viewed from this distance is unexpectedly touching. The fire catches fully now, its flames climbing with renewed confidence, its heat pushing outward in a wave that reaches you where you stand. Thomas sits back on his heels and watches it for a moment, his face illuminated orange, his expression carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who has just prevented something bad from happening. He does not smile exactly. Smiling feels like tempting fate in this world. But his shoulders drop slightly, the held tension releasing, and he reaches toward the warmth with both hands, as though accepting something offered. The hall brightens, shadows retreat to the corners. The dogs lift their heads and settle them again with the leisurely confidence of animals who understood all along that the fire would return. Morning is fully here now, cold, demanding, and already making its requirements known. The fire is burning, Thomas has done his job, and now it is time for you to do yours, which begins, as it always begins, with getting dressed. This sounds simple. In the world you came from, it is simple, a matter of minutes of choices arranged in a wardrobe of fabric that slides on easily and sits comfortably against skin that has never had to think very hard about temperature. In the world of 1280, getting dressed is something closer to a tactical operation. It is the first defence you will mount against the cold today, and if you mount it poorly, the cold will find the gaps and exploit them with a patience and thoroughness that no human enemy could match. You begin in the dark. Not complete dark, the hall fire throws enough light to work by a warm, unsteady orange that reaches the sleeping area where your belongings are kept. Your clothing was not folded last night. Folding is a refinement available to people with furniture and sufficient space and the mental energy for tidiness at the end of a 14-hour working day. Your clothing was removed in a specific order and placed in a specific pile, because you will put it back on in reverse order, and in the dark sequence matters enormously. You have done this enough times that your hands know the pile by touch rather than sight. The first layer goes on against your skin. Linen if you are fortunate, and you are marginally more fortunate than the servants in some households. A linen undertunic loose and long-reaching past your knees. Linen is not warm in itself. What it does is create a barrier between your skin and the layers above it, preventing the rougher wool from abrading you directly. And crucially, it is a layer that can be washed with some regularity, which matters more than it might seem in a world where bathing in winter is a complicated and infrequent event. The linen goes on first. It is cold. It warms quickly against your body, and this brief moment of cold fabric against warm skin is one of those small daily discomforts that you stopped registering years ago. Over the linen goes wool. This is the primary thermal layer, the one doing the real work of keeping you alive, and it is heavier than you might expect. Medieval wool was not the refined lightweight material of modern textiles, but a dense lanolin-rich fabric that held its structure through years of use and retained warmth even when damp. Damp is a significant consideration. Winter in an English castle means damp wool is your frequent companion from the outdoor work, from the washing, from the general atmospheric moisture of a building, where the difference between inside and outside temperatures is smaller than it should be. Wet wool still insulates. This is not a myth. The lanolin, the natural oil present in unprocessed wool, creates a mild water resistance, and the fibre structure of wool continues to trap air even when wet. Medieval people did not know the chemistry. They knew the result. Wool kept you alive even on the days it kept you uncomfortable. A curious note from textile historians: the quality of a medieval servant's wool clothing varied dramatically by household and by the individual servant's position within it. In some wealthier establishments, servants received an annual livery, a set of clothing provided by the household as part of their compensation, which might include reasonable quality wool of a consistent colour, identifying them as belonging to a particular lord. In smaller or less prosperous households, servants provided their own clothing, which meant wearing whatever they could afford or inherit or patch together from previous garments. The servant who appears in the historical record is often wearing something that has been mended so many times the original fabric is more memory than material. You pull the wool tunic over your head and feel the familiar weight settle onto your shoulders. Then the second wool layer, a shorter overgown belted at the waist, which serves the double purpose of adding thermal mass and keeping the lower tunic from catching on things as you move through the castle's narrow passages and low doorways. The belt is leather cracked at one point near the buckle, where it has been folded the same way too many times. You have been meaning to repair it since October. It is now January. Your feet next. This is where the cold makes its most persistent argument. Because feet are the part of you in constant contact with stone floors and frozen ground, and no amount of upper body layering compensates for feet that are inadequately wrapped. You win linen strips around each foot first, not elegant but effective, creating a base layer that the wool hose will sit over. The hose themselves are knitted wool pulled up to the knee and tied with a simple cord. Over them go shoes, leather thick-soled by the standards of their making, resoled twice since you received them. They are not waterproof. Nothing in your wardrobe is genuinely waterproof. But they are substantial, and substance this morning is everything. Historians still argue about how effectively medieval lower-class footwear actually protected against cold and wet. Some researchers point to archaeological finds of remarkably well-constructed leather shoes from medieval contexts, suggesting a level of craft that provided genuine protection. Others note the frequency of references to chilblains, the painful inflammation caused by repeated exposure to cold and damp in medieval medical texts, and personal accounts suggesting that footwear, however well made, was losing the battle against English winters with some regularity. Both things are likely true simultaneously. The shoes were good, the winters were worse. Your hands get the last attention wrapped in strips of rough wool, not gloves exactly, but close enough tied at the wrist. They will come off when you reach the kitchen, where gloves and fire are a poor combination, but for the corridor between here and there they are essential. The cold that lives in castle corridors is particularly interested in exposed hands. You stand fully dressed now in the flickering light of Thomas's rebuilt fire and take a moment to simply exist in this state of layered preparation. You're not warm. Warmth is not really the goal. The goal is the management of cold, the reduction of its impact to a level that permits function. You have achieved that, for now. Outside, the sky is just beginning to consider the possibility of light. A thin grey line at the edge of the world, barely visible through the shuttered window above you, suggesting that dawn is thinking about arriving, weighing its options not yet committed. You're already dressed. You're already moving. Dawn will have to catch up. There is a map of warmth inside this castle, and you know it the way you know your own heartbeat, not by thinking about it, but by living inside it day after day until it becomes instinct. Some rooms are warm, most rooms are not. And the distance between those two categories is not merely a matter of comfort. In the world of 1280, it is a matter of rank of power, of the visible and daily demonstration of where you stand in the order of things. Cold in a medieval castle is not distributed randomly. It is distributed deliberately. An understanding that distribution tells you almost everything you need to know about how this society understands itself. At the top of the warmth hierarchy sits the Lord Solar. You have been in this room perhaps 3 times in your years of service here, always on specific errands, always briefly, always aware that your presence in it was a temporary permission rather than a right. The Solar is the Lord's private sitting and sleeping chamber, positioned on the upper floor of the castle's residential block, and it has luxury of luxuries, a proper wall fireplace with a stone chimney. This technology, which seems so basic from the modern perspective, represented a genuine architectural and social advancement in 1280. A wall fireplace contains and directs heat far more efficiently than an open, central hearth. It fills a smaller room with warmth more effectively. It produces less smoke in the inhabited space, and crucially it is private. The Lord's warmth is the Lord's warmth. It does not have to be shared with dogs and servants and the accumulated humanity of the Great Hall. The Solar's fireplace burns through most of the night, tended by the Lord's personal body servant, a position of considerable prestige, not because the work is pleasant, but because proximity to the Lord, even sleeping, proximity translates into influence, information, and occasional favour. The body servant sleeps on a pallet outside the Lord's chamber door, close enough to hear a call, close enough to benefit from the warmth leaking under the door. This is not incidental. This is the economy of heat made social. Below the Solar in the warmth hierarchy sits the ladies' chamber, which has its own smaller fireplace and its own attendant hierarchy of ladies-in-waiting, and personal maids whose sleeping arrangements place them in descending order of warmth, depending on their standing. The ladies' chief attendant sleeps inside the chamber. The junior maids sleep in an anteroom. The lowest-ranking maid sleeps in the corridor outside on a pallet, with a wool blanket and whatever warmth seeps through the gap beneath the door. She's warmer than you. You're warmer than the stable boy who sleeps in the straw with the horses. The horses are thermally speaking doing quite well. A mainstream historical fact worth pausing on the deliberate use of architectural space to express and enforce social hierarchy was not incidental in medieval castle design, it was intentional. Historians of medieval architecture note that the progression from Great Hall to solar to private chambers follows a consistent logic of increasing privacy and increasing warmth that maps precisely onto increasing social status. The further you could retreat from the communal fire, the higher your rank, because only the highest ranks could afford to heat their private retreats. Everyone else gathered around the shared warmth of the hall and understood without being told what that gathering meant about their place in the world. You're in the middle of this hierarchy, which means you're in the middle of the cold. Not the worst cold that belongs to those who work primarily outdoors, the stable hands and the outer ward labourers, and the gatehouse guards who stand their watches in wind that finds every gap in their clothing with the focused malevolence of something personal. But not the managed cold of the well-positioned domestic servant, the one whose duties keep them near the kitchen, or the hall fire for significant portions of the day. You move through the castle's temperature gradient, continuously passing from the kitchen's relative warmth to the corridor's sharp cold, to the hall's moderate heat, to the storage room's absolute chill, your body adjusting and readjusting, with each transition in the way of something that has been doing this long enough to accept it as normal. The storage rooms are worth a brief visit, because they represent the cold end of the castle's thermal spectrum in a way that is almost impressive. The undercroft. The ground floor vaulted storage space beneath the main residential block maintains a temperature in winter that hovers just above freezing. This is in fact partly intentional. Cold storage was useful for preserving food, and the undercroft's consistent low temperature served a practical function analogous to a modern refrigerator. The salted meat, the hard cheese, the root vegetables packed in straw, the barrels of ale and wine, all of these benefited from the cold that made the humans who retrieved them deeply uncomfortable. You have spent time in the undercroft on winter mornings fetching provisions, and the cold there is of a quality distinct from the cold elsewhere in the castle. It is still an absolute and smells faintly of earth and stone and the accumulated cool of centuries. It does not bite, it simply surrounds. A philosophical moment arrives as you move through the castle's middle corridor carrying a bundle of linen toward the laundry. The cold is pressing against you from the stone walls on both sides, and you're walking quickly, not running. Running is for emergencies, and this is simply Tuesday, but with the efficient pace of someone who understands that movement generates heat and stillness surrenders it. You think about warmth as a resource, not a comfort, not an amenity, but a resource finite, unevenly distributed, requiring constant effort to maintain and easily lost through inattention or misfortune. In your world, warmth is the default. In this world, warmth is the achievement. There is still debate among historians about whether medieval servants experienced their thermal conditions as suffering, or simply as weather, as the background condition of existence rather than a deprivation. Some researchers point to the relative silence on the subject in lower-class medieval sources, arguing that cold was so universal as to be unremarkable. Others note that the few genuine lower-class voices that survive in court, records in penitential literature and the occasional servant's account, do mention cold with an emphasis that suggests it was felt, not merely endured. The cold that stiffens your fingers as you walk this corridor is real. It has always been real, whether or not anyone wrote it down. You reach the laundry room door and push it open with your shoulder, both hands occupied. The room beyond is cold in its own particular way. The damp cold of wet fabric and stone troughs a cold that clings differently than the dry cold of the corridor. You set down your bundle and blow on your fingers, a gesture so automatic you barely notice you're doing it. The castle's hierarchy of warmth has placed you here. You did not choose it, but you have learned it, mapped it, navigated it daily with the expertise of someone for whom this knowledge is not academic but essential. You know where the warm rooms are, you know who lives in them, and you know with the pragmatic clarity of someone who has never had the luxury of pretending otherwise exactly what that difference means. The laundry room is behind you now, and your fingers are beginning to remember what feeling feels like. You are moving again, which helps through a corridor that connects the residential block to the Great Hall's northern wall, and as you walk you are thinking, not philosophically, not abstractly, but practically in the way that cold mornings demand about heat, specifically about the various methods this castle employs to generate it, contain it, and deliver it to the places where human beings need it most. Because the medieval approach to heating was not passive. It was not simply a matter of lighting a fire and hoping for the best. It was a system imperfect, labour-intensive, occasionally dangerous, but a system nonetheless, and understanding it tells you something important about the ingenuity of people working at the absolute edge of what their technology could provide. The wall fireplace in the Lord's Solar, which you have already noted with a mixture of admiration and mild resentment, represents the cutting edge of domestic heating technology in 1280. The principle is straightforward: contain the fire within a stone surround, direct the smoke upward through a chimney, and allow the stone surround itself to absorb and radiate heat into the room. The stone acts as a thermal battery, absorbing warmth during the fire's active burn and releasing it slowly as the fire dies back overnight. A well-constructed stone fireplace surround can continue radiating meaningful heat for several hours after the fire itself has been reduced to embers. This is not magic. It is masonry doing what masonry does when someone has thought carefully about how to use it. But the wall fireplace is new, expensive, and architecturally demanding. It requires a chimney built into or against the wall, which means planning during construction or significant modification afterward. Most of the castle's rooms do not have one. Most of the castle's rooms rely on older, simpler methods, and the oldest and simplest of these is the brazier. You pass one now, standing in the alcove near the chapel entrance, a large iron bowl mounted on 3 legs filled with glowing charcoal radiating heat into the small stone space with admirable efficiency. The brazier is ancient technology used in one form or another since the Bronze Age, and it persists into the medieval period because it works. It is portable. It requires no architectural modification. It can be moved to wherever heat is needed and removed when the need passes. Its fuel charcoal or sometimes seasoned wood is manageable in quantity and relatively predictable in behaviour, and it produces, when burning cleanly, a steady dry heat that fills a small enclosed space with surprising effectiveness. The limitation of the brazier is carbon monoxide. This is a fact that medieval people understood imperfectly and experienced with tragic regularity. Charcoal burning in a poorly ventilated space consumes oxygen and produces carbon monoxide, a colourless, odourless gas that causes drowsiness, confusion, and eventually death, without any of the warning signals that might prompt a person to leave the room. Medieval sources contain enough references to people found unconscious or dead near braziers in enclosed chambers to suggest this was a recognised hazard. The standard response was ventilation, leaving a window, cracked a door slightly open, maintaining some airflow even at the cost of heat. Whether this precaution was consistently applied is another matter. On a January night when the wind is coming from the northeast and the temperature has dropped below freezing, the appeal of sealing every gap and letting the brazier run is not difficult to understand. Historians still argue about how frequently medieval brazier-related deaths actually occurred and whether contemporaries fully understood the cause. Some researchers point to medical texts of the period that describe the symptoms of what we would now recognise as carbon monoxide poisoning, suggesting at least a partial understanding of the danger. Others note that the symptoms, drowsiness, heaviness, a desire to sleep, would have been difficult to distinguish from simple exhaustion in people who were already chronically tired and living in conditions that made sleep attractive at almost any hour. The line between a servant who fell asleep by the brazier and a servant who was overcome by it may have been invisible until it was too late. You move past the brazier, feeling its warmth on the left side of your face as you pass a brief specific warmth, like a hand held momentarily close. It is gone almost immediately as you continue down the corridor, replaced by the corridor's default temperature, which is to say the temperature of the stone itself. The warming stones are next on your mental inventory of the castle's heating systems, because it is approaching the time of morning when they need to be prepared. Warming stones, flat pieces of dense rock or ceramic heated in the kitchen fire until they are too hot to handle without wrapping, then carried to various locations throughout the castle, represent perhaps the most direct form of medieval heat delivery. They are placed in beds before sleep, wrapped in cloth to prevent burns radiating warmth into the sheets and blankets for the hours it takes a body to generate its own thermal equilibrium. They are placed at the feet of the elderly and the sick. They are used to warm the Lord's clothing before dressing, a task performed by the body servant, who holds each garment near the fire or drapes it over a heated stone to take the morning chill out of the fabric before it touches the Lord's skin. A quirky detail that tends to delight people who study medieval domestic life in some larger households, the accounts record the purchase of specific stones for warming purposes, particular types of dense heat-retaining rock that were valued for their ability to hold warmth longer than ordinary stones. These appear in household inventories alongside other functional objects listed with matter-of-fact practicality, evidence that someone had done the empirical work of comparing different stones' heat retention and made purchasing decisions accordingly. Medieval people were not romantic about their technology. They were pragmatic. They used what worked, replaced what failed, and recorded the costs with the unsentimental thoroughness of people for whom resources were finite and waste was not an option. The tapestries you noticed earlier this morning were doing their work too, insulating the walls, trapping air, reducing the rate at which the stone absorbed heat from the room. In the grandest castles, multiple layers of hangings were used, sometimes with straw or other insulating material packed between the tapestry and the wall. The effect was meaningful. Researchers studying medieval thermal environments estimate that well-hung tapestries could raise the perceived temperature of a stone room by several degrees simply by reducing the cold radiation from the walls. Several degrees in this context is not trivial. Several degrees is the difference between a room where you can sit still and work and a room where you cannot stop moving without beginning to shiver. You reach the kitchen passage and collect 2 warming stones from the hearth's edge wrapped in thick cloth, their heat pressing through the layers into your palms. They're heavy, and they are wonderful. You carry them with the careful reverence of someone transporting something genuinely precious, which is exactly what you're doing. The castle has no central heating. It has no insulated walls, no double-glazed windows, no thermostat maintaining a steady interior temperature, regardless of what the sky is doing outside. What it has is this, a collection of strategies, technologies, and human efforts, each imperfect, individually, collectively capable of keeping the people inside it alive and functioning through the longest winters England produces. It is not elegant, but it works, and in the world of 1280, working is the only standard that matters. The warming stones are delivered. You handed them to the appropriate person, the Lord's body servant, a thin man of middle age, with the permanently watchful expression of someone whose job requires him to anticipate needs before they are expressed. And he received them without acknowledgement, which is the customary receipt for work, performed correctly in this household. You are back in the kitchen now, and the pottage is finally ready. Agnes ladles it into a wooden bowl and sets it on the preparation table without ceremony, and you eat standing up, which is how most servants eat most meals, because sitting implies leisure, and leisure implies time, and time in a medieval castle in January is the one resource in shorter supply than firewood. The pottage is thick and grey and faintly salty, and it is without question the best thing you have experienced today. Heat spreading from your stomach outward, reaching your hands and feet with a warmth that no external fire has managed to deliver this morning. This is the thing about food in winter that modern people surrounded by central heating have largely forgotten. Eating is not merely nutrition, it is thermal management. It is stoking the internal fire that keeps the external cold at a manageable distance. The medieval understanding of food as fuel against cold was both intuitive and remarkably sophisticated for its time. The humoral theory of medicine, the dominant framework through which medieval people understood the body's relationship with food and environment, held that different foods possessed different qualities of heat and moisture that interacted with the body's own humoral balance. Hot, moist foods were prescribed in winter to counteract the cold, dry qualities of the season. Spiced foods were considered warming not merely in the culinary sense, but in the medical one. Ale drunk warm was actively therapeutic. This theoretical framework was wrong in its specifics, but directionally correct in its intuitions. Calorie-dense warming foods do help the body maintain its core temperature in cold conditions, and the medieval preference for hearty winter eating reflected a genuine understanding of the body's needs, even if the explanation for those needs was entirely mistaken. Your pottage contains oats, water, a small amount of dried peas, and what might charitably be described as the memory of a turnip. It is January, which means the fresh vegetables of autumn are gone, the root cellars are entering their depleted middle phase, and the kitchen is operating on the preserved dried and salted provisions that were laid in during the more abundant months. This is the hungry gap before it earned that name, the long stretch between the end of autumn's plenty and the beginning of spring's new growth when the food is still adequate, but the variety is narrowed to a point that makes every meal a variation on the previous one. A mainstream historical fact worth understanding, the medieval diet in winter was not uniformly grim, but it was uniformly constrained by the logic of preservation. Salting, smoking, drying, and fermenting were the 4 pillars of medieval food storage, and each produced a distinct set of flavours and textures that defined winter eating. Salted meat pork primarily, but also beef and fish was the protein staple. It was preserved in barrels of brine from the autumn slaughter, retrieved as needed, desalted by soaking in fresh water, before cooking and then boiled or stewed until the salt was drawn out and the meat was tender enough to eat. The result was not what the meat had been in summer. It was something different, denser, saltier, despite the soaking, with a particular texture that fresh meat does not have. Medieval people ate it because they had it, and they had it because without it there would be nothing. Agnes is already preparing the next stage of the morning, the bread that will accompany the household's midday meal, the broth that will be made from yesterday's bones, the dried herbs that will go into the pottage's next iteration. She moves through these tasks with a calm authority that is almost hypnotic to watch her hands performing complex sequences without apparent conscious direction. You have worked near Agnes for 2 winters now, and you have come to understand that her competence is not merely skill, but philosophy. She wastes nothing. She plans across days and weeks, not just hours. She knows exactly how many people she's feeding, what provisions remain, how long they must last, and what combinations of available ingredients will sustain a household of 30 through the remaining weeks of winter without either boring them into revolt or running out entirely. This is a kind of intelligence that history tends not to record, because it is not the intelligence of courts, or battles, or theological debate. It is the intelligence of the kitchen, practical, adaptive, invisible, essential. Agnes will not appear in any chronicle. Her name will not be in the Lord's accounts except as a quarterly wage payment. But the household's survival through this winter is in ways that the Lord himself probably does not fully appreciate substantially her achievement. A quirky detail that food historians find genuinely interesting: spices in the medieval period were not primarily luxury items in the way popular history sometimes suggests. Yes, they were expensive. Yes, their presence on a table was a signal of wealth and status, but they also served a genuine preservation and palatability function. Certain spices inhibit bacterial growth. Others mask the flavour of meat that has spent several months in a salt barrel and emerged imperfectly desalted, and all of them provided variety in a diet that the season was aggressively narrowing. The Lord's table had spices because the Lord could afford them. The servant's pottage had none. This difference was felt most acutely not as a matter of flavour preference, but as a matter of eating the same unvaried thing every morning, every winter until spring arrived, and the world remembered how to taste like something other than salt and smoke. You finish your pottage and set the bowl aside. The warmth it delivered is already settling into something more sustainable, not the sharp heat of fresh food hitting an empty stomach, but a steady internal temperature that will carry you through the next few hours of work. You roll your shoulders, feeling the wool move against the linen beneath it, the layered fabric doing its quiet work. The kitchen smells of smoke and grain, and the faint sweetness of the herbs Agnes keeps in bundles above the hearth, dried lavender, rosemary, time their fragrance released by the fire's warmth into the room's air. It is not a beautiful smell. It is better than beautiful. It is the smell of a room where people are fed, where cold is managed, where the basic requirements of survival are met with daily consistency. You think of the pottage still sitting warm in your stomach and feel something that is not happiness exactly, but is close to it, the particular contentment of a body that has what it needs, at least for this moment, at least for this morning. Outside, the frost is still absolute, the cold is still waiting, but you are fed. And fed is a kind of warm that no stone wall can take from you. The kitchen warmth is behind you again. It is always behind you that is the nature of warmth in this castle, always retreating as you move toward the next task, always waiting when you return. This morning's next task takes you outside, and outside is a different category of cold entirely. The cold inside the castle, for all its persistence, is at least a still cold, a contained cold. The cold that meets you as you push through the heavy oak door of the outer ward is moving cold, purposeful cold with wind behind it, and nothing in particular to stop it between here and the distant grey hills visible on the horizon. You stop for just a moment in the doorway, not from hesitation, but from the instinctive pause of a body registering a significant environmental change. The temperature drops several degrees in the space of a single step. The wind finds the gap at your collar, immediately slides under your wool layers, with the focused efficiency of something that has been doing this for centuries. Your eyes begin to water. The skin on your face, the only part of you that is genuinely exposed, tightens, a physical response so automatic you have stopped consciously noticing it, though your face notices. Your face always notices. The outer ward stretches before you, a wide cobbled courtyard enclosed by the castle's outer walls. In summer, this space is busy, and relatively pleasant deliveries, arriving horses being led the general commerce of a functioning medieval household, flowing through it with the organised chaos of a place that has found its rhythm. In January it's something else. The cobbles are glazed with ice in the places where yesterday's foot traffic compressed the overnight frost into something more permanent. The stone walls on 3 sides channel the wind rather than blocking it, creating a cold that is directional and relentless. A cart sits against the eastern wall, its wooden wheels frozen to the ground, which is both a practical problem and a small visual symbol of everything January means in this world. Your destination is the well. The well sits in the centre of the outer ward, a stone-lined shaft sunk deep into the hill below the castle, its water drawn up by a wooden bucket on an iron-reinforced rope wound around a horizontal windlass. In summer, drawing water from this well is a moderately tedious task made tolerable by the fact that it is simply tedious. In winter, it is a daily negotiation with ice metal wood and frozen rope that requires patient, specific knowledge and hands that can function in temperatures that make function difficult. You reach the well and examine it with the expert eye of someone who has dealt with its winter moods before. The windlass handle is frost-covered, which you expected you brought a rag for this. Wrapping it around the handle before gripping because bare skin on frozen iron in the morning carries risks you have no interest in revisiting. The rope is stiff with cold, its fibres locked together by the overnight freeze, which means it will need working before it moves freely. You begin turning the windlass slowly, feeling the rope resist and then grudgingly yield its stiffness, decreasing as the friction of motion generates the minimal warmth necessary to loosen it. A mainstream historical fact that tends to reframe people's understanding of medieval daily life. The provision of water in a medieval castle or manor was a significant logistical operation, particularly in winter. Historians studying household accounts note that water carrying the transport of water from source to point of use throughout the building occupied a meaningful portion of servants' daily labour. Unlike the Lord's Hall, which might have cisterns or interior water supplies, the majority of a medieval household's water needs were met by human beings carrying heavy containers through long distances and multiple floors. The weight of a full iron-banded wooden bucket is approximately 15 to 20 kilograms. The distance from this well to the kitchen is perhaps 40 metres and 2 steps. The distance to the upper residential floors is considerably more. You will make this journey many times today. The bucket descends. You hear it hit water, not the clean splash of summer, but a duller sound, a sound that suggests the water surface is not entirely liquid. You turn the windlass in reverse, hauling the bucket back up and examine what you have. A partial bucket of very cold water with a thin skim of ice across its surface, already reforming at the edges now that it is exposed to the air. You break the ice with your knuckle, a sharp tap efficient the gesture of someone accustomed to it, and carry the bucket toward the kitchen door. The ice on the outer ward cobbles is the morning's other concern. It is your responsibility, or rather the responsibility of whoever is first in the yard, which this morning is you, to spread ash or sand across the worst of the icy patches before the household's more senior members begin moving through the space. The ash comes from last night's hearth, collected in a bucket and kept near the inner door for exactly this purpose. You scatter it across the glazed cobbles in a practiced arc, watching it dull the ice's shine and provide something approaching traction. It is a temporary solution. The ice will reform under the ash by afternoon. You will deal with that then. A curious detail that historians of medieval castle management note, with some frequency, the outdoor maintenance tasks of winter, ice clearing, snow removal, keeping pathways passable, appear in household accounts primarily as labour costs, rather than material ones, which tells you something about how they were accomplished. There was no salt supply kept for ice management, no specialised equipment. There were people, there were ashes, there were shovels, and there was the daily labour of keeping a functioning household accessible to itself, despite what the weather was attempting. You make 3 more trips to the well before the morning's water requirement is met, enough for the kitchen's cooking needs, enough for the Lord's morning wash, enough for the horses in the stable block, whose water trough has frozen solid overnight, and requires not bucket water but direct intervention, with an iron bar to break the ice before they can drink. The horses are patient about this. They have been through enough winters to understand the sequence. They stand at the trough with a philosophical stillness that you find on particularly cold mornings genuinely admirable. The stable is warmer than the outer ward, which is one of the compensations of the horse-related work. The body heat of 4 large animals raises the stable's temperature to something that feels almost hospitable after the open courtyard. The smell is considerable, but smell and cold are a trade you will make without hesitation on a morning like this. You break the ice in the trough, refill it from your bucket, and stand for a moment in the stable's comparative warmth, your face slowly returning to its normal temperature. The horses breathe around you in slow rhythmic clouds, their exhalations visible in the cold air, their large bodies radiating a heat so steady and generous, it feels almost intentional. One turns its head and regards you with the large calm eye of an animal that has never had to worry about the well freezing because there has always been a person to unfreeze it. You look back at it for a moment, then you pick up your bucket and go back to work. The chapel is behind you now, and the warming stone you delivered to the chaplain's room is already doing its quiet work somewhere in the castle's upper floor. Your hands are cold again. They're always cold again, within minutes of leaving any warm space the corridor between here and anywhere, reclaiming whatever the fire gave you, with the patient efficiency of something that has been doing this longer than you have been alive. You blow on your fingers as you walk a gesture so automatic it requires no decision, and turn toward the part of the castle that your feet know before your mind does. The monastery is not here. You are not a monk. But this morning, for reasons that have to do with a specific errand and a borrowed jar of rendered fat from the kitchen that the castle's chaplain requested for a purpose he did not explain, your path takes you past the small attached priory that sits against the castle's eastern wall, a modest establishment of perhaps 8 brothers affiliated with a larger house, 2 days' ride north existing in that particular medieval arrangement, where the sacred and the domestic share a wall and occasionally share a meal. You have always found the priory strange in winter, not unpleasantly strange, simply other. The quality of cold inside it is different from the cold of the castle in a way you have never quite been able to articulate. The castle's cold is purposeful, directional, the cold of wind and gap and stone mass. The priory's cold is still. It sits in the vaulted spaces like something that has been there since the building was constructed, and has simply never been asked to leave. The monks move through it in their heavy habits, with a composure that you find either inspiring or incomprehensible depending on the morning. This morning, passing through the priory's small cloister on the shortcut to the chaplain's room, you encounter Brother Edmund, not the castle's Edmund, a different Edmund younger with ink-stained fingers, and the particular pallor of someone who spends most of his hours indoors crossing the cloister garth with a bucket of charcoal, and the expression of a man engaged in a task he considers beneath his spiritual calling, but is performing with full conscientiousness regardless. He nods at you. You nod back. This is the entirety of your relationship conducted across dozens of similar corridors over several years, and it is sufficient. You follow him because he is heading toward the califactorium, and the califactorium is warm, and the chaplain's room is adjacent to it, and there is no rule that says you cannot stand near warmth while delivering fat to a priest. The califactorium is the single heated room in the priory. The warming room, the one concession that the Benedictine rule made to the reality of English winters and human bodies' non-negotiable requirements. It is not large. Perhaps 4 meters square its ceiling, low enough that a tall man would feel it, its single fireplace, a proper wall, fireplace older and more worn than the Lord's solars but functional burning, with a steadiness that suggests it has not been allowed to go out since October. The room smells of charcoal smoke and old wool, and something faintly herbal that you cannot identify, but that your body responds to as warmth, before your skin has even registered the temperature change. You step inside just far enough to be within the fire's influence and feel the cold in your hands begin its slow retreat. The monks use this room in rotation 20 minutes each by the rule's allowance twice daily in winter. They come in pairs or small groups, warm themselves in relative silence, and return to the cold disciplines of the cloister. The warming is not a luxury in the modern sense. It is maintenance. A monk whose fingers are too numb to hold a quill cannot copy manuscripts. A monk whose joints have stiffened past function cannot perform the physical demands of the liturgical hours. The califactorium exists because the work of the monastery requires bodies that function, and bodies that have been sitting in a freezing scriptorium for 3 hours have stopped functioning at the margins. A curious detail that historians of monastic life find quietly extraordinary. The scraps of manuscript that survive from medieval English monasteries sometimes show the physical evidence of the cold in which they were made. The ink thickens in low temperatures, producing lines of uneven width. The parchment contracts slightly, causing fine calligraphy to distort at its edges. Some illuminated manuscripts show faint smudging at the lower corners of pages, the place where cold, stiffened fingers gripped the parchment and left the trace of their struggle. You're looking at art made by freezing hands. You're looking at devotion conducted in discomfort so complete it left marks on the work itself. You think about this as you stand near the califactorium's fire, the chaplain's fat in your hands, your fingers slowly reclaiming their sensation 1 degree at a time. The monks who made those manuscripts were not so different from you in this particular respect: cold hands, warm room, the brief window of function, that warmth provides the return to cold that follows. Their cold was theological in its framing a discipline chosen and endured as part of a larger spiritual practice. Your cold is simply the condition of your employment, but the hands are the same, the fire is the same, the relief when it comes is the same relief. There is still debate among historians about whether medieval monks genuinely experienced their cold as spiritual discipline, or whether beneath the theological framework they simply experienced it as cold as any person would, and found the theology useful for making sense of something unavoidable. The manuscripts suggest the latter, or at least suggest that the two experiences were not mutually exclusive. You can believe your suffering has meaning and still feel it as suffering. You can frame your cold as penitence and still be cold. Brother Edmund has deposited his charcoal and is standing on the fire's other side, his hands extended toward the heat, with an unself-consciousness that makes you like him, despite knowing nothing about him. His habit is heavy wool darker at the sleeves, where it has absorbed years of ink and kitchen and weather. His feet in their sandals are visibly red. He notices you noticing, and looks down at them with an expression of mild philosophical acceptance that seems to say, yes, these are cold feet. They have always been cold feet. This is simply the condition of feet. You deliver the fat to the chaplain's door knock, once leave it, and retrace your steps through the cloister. The cold reclaims you immediately and completely, as it always does, as it will continue to do until April. But for the space of those few minutes in the califactorium standing beside a monk with ink-stained fingers and cold red feet, you felt something that had less to do with temperature than with the simple recognition of shared condition. He was cold. You were cold. The fire was warm for both of you. In a world organised so thoroughly around hierarchy and difference, this particular equality, the equality of cold, the democracy of the warming room, was not nothing. It was in its small way everything. The castle gate is behind you now, or rather the idea of the castle gate, the threshold between the world of stone corridors and managed fires, and the world beyond the walls where winter operates without any of the mitigation that human habitation provides. You have not left the castle this morning. Your duties have kept you within its walls, within its imperfect but real shelter, but the village is there visible through the gatehouse arch. When you pass it on your way between the outer ward and the inner court, a cluster of low shapes perhaps 200 metres down the frozen track. Smoke rising from several points in the thatched roofline in thin grey columns that bend eastward in the wind. You know the village. You came from it or somewhere very like it before service in the castle changed the coordinates of your daily existence, and this morning, as you pass the gatehouse arch and feel the wind from the open country beyond your mind goes there down the track through the village gate into the world that most of the people in England actually inhabit. Not the castle with its stone walls and its hierarchy of warmth and its central hearth, tended by a boy named Thomas. The hovel, the one-room dwelling that is home to approximately half the population of medieval England, and whose relationship with winter cold makes the castle's thermal challenges look by comparison almost manageable. The peasant dwelling of 1280 is an architectural object of radical simplicity. In its most basic form, and many of them are very close to their most basic form, it is a rectangular structure, with walls of wattle and daub, a thatched roof, a single door, and no windows in the glazed sense of the word. There may be 1 or 2 small openings in the wall that can be covered with a wooden shutter or a piece of oiled cloth, admitting light when the weather permits and sealed against it when the weather does not. The floor is earth-packed hard by years of feet. The hearth is a flat stone or a clay-lined depression in the floor's centre, and the smoke rises to the roof and finds its way out through the thatch or doesn't, and fills the room with a haze that gives the interior its characteristic atmosphere of perpetual soft fog. Into this space in winter goes a family. A typical peasant household might contain a husband and wife, 3 to 5 children of various ages, and a grandmother or grandfather too old for field work, but still occupying space and consuming resources, and contributing in their diminishing way to the household's thermal budget. Body heat in a space this small with this many occupants is a genuine and meaningful contributor to the room's temperature. 6 human bodies in a room perhaps 5 metres by 4 metres generate a collective warmth that raises the interior temperature measurably above the outside air. This is not metaphor, it is physics, and medieval peasant families understood it with the practical clarity of people for whom the physics of warmth was a survival matter rather than an academic one. Also into this space in winter go the animals. This is the detail that tends to produce the most vivid reaction in modern audiences, and it is entirely true. The practice of bringing livestock, primarily a cow or an ox, sometimes a pig, occasionally sheep, into the dwelling space during the coldest months was widespread in medieval Europe, documented in agricultural records, criticised by church officials who found it theologically problematic for reasons that are their own, and defended by peasants who understood that a cow in the room generated the thermal equivalent of a substantial fire without consuming any firewood. A single cow at rest produces roughly as much body heat as several humans. A cow, a pig, and a few sheep in a small room with a family of 6 produces an interior temperature that is, by the brutal standards of medieval January, actually survivable, without the fire burning at full intensity through the night. A mainstream historical fact that deserves full appreciation. Historians studying medieval peasant dwellings through both documentary and archaeological evidence have confirmed that the longhouse, a structure in which the human dwelling and the animal byre were built under one continuous roof separated by a low partition, or simply by convention, was the dominant form of rural housing across much of northern Europe throughout the medieval period. This was not primitive oversight. It was deliberate design. The animal's warmth heated the human space. The human's proximity allowed them to monitor the animal's health through the night. The arrangement was mutually beneficial in ways that extended beyond temperature. The animals were safer from predators and theft, and the family had immediate access to their most valuable possessions at all times. A curious detail that medieval agricultural historians enjoy the smell of a longhouse in winter was something that visitors from outside consistently noted, with varying degrees of diplomacy. A Flemish account from the 13th century describes entering a peasant dwelling and being struck by an atmosphere so dense with smoke, animal odour, and human occupation that the writer momentarily could not identify the door through which he had entered. He eventually found a seat near the fire, and he reports stopped noticing the smell within perhaps a quarter hour. Adaptation is swift when the alternative is standing in the cold. You think about the longhouse as you move through the castle's inner court, and you feel something that is not quite gratitude and not quite guilt, but sits between them. You sleep in the great hall on rushes near a fire in a building made of stone. You are cold, genuinely cold in ways that your body registers and your hands demonstrate. But the family in that dwelling 200 metres down the track, the ones you can see the smoke of, if not the people themselves, are navigating a winter that operates without any of the castle's interventions. No stone mass to moderate the temperature swings, no kitchen fire burning through the night, no Agnes managing provisions across weeks and months. Just a family, a cow, a pile of thatch overhead, and the collective warmth of their bodies pressed together in the dark. There is still debate among historians about the relative quality of life for castle servants versus free peasants in medieval England. Some researchers argue that castle service, despite its hierarchical constraints and its demands on personal freedom, provided material conditions, food security, shelter, access to fire, that peasant smallholders could not reliably guarantee. Others point to the peasants' relative autonomy, the ownership of land, however small, the freedom from the daily subordination that castle service entailed. The argument is genuinely complex, and the evidence points in multiple directions. What is not complex is the cold. The cold is the same outside the castle walls as inside them, and beyond them. In the village it is operating without restraint or mitigation. The family in the longhouse knows things about winter that you with your hall fire and your pottage and your warming stones will never fully understand. They have gone deeper into it than you have. They have negotiated with it at a level of intimacy that changes a person. The smoke from their roof bends in the wind and disappears into the grey sky. You watch it for a moment, this small evidence of a fire burning somewhere out there, of people doing what people do, finding warmth, maintaining it, surviving. Then the wind pushes you back toward the castle door and you go. The califactorium is behind you now, its warmth already a memory your hands are refusing to let go of. You're back in the castle's main corridor, moving toward the hall, and the cold has resumed its conversation with your skin in the direct, unambiguous way of something that was simply waiting for you to return. Your fingers are functional. That is the standard. Not warm, not comfortable, functional. capable of gripping, carrying, performing the tasks that the afternoon requires. Functional is sufficient. Functional is in the world of 1280 a kind of luxury disguised as a baseline. Edmund is near the fire when you enter the hall. He has not moved significantly since this morning, which tells you something without requiring you to ask anyone. The cup Agnes gave him sits empty beside him, which tells you something better, that he drank it, that the remedy went in, that his body is currently in possession of the warm, herbal intervention that Agnes decided it needed. His chest is still audible when the hall is quiet enough to hear it, but his colour is slightly better than this morning's grey, or perhaps that is the firelight, or perhaps you are simply choosing to read it that way because the alternative is less comfortable. You set down what you're carrying and crouch near the hearth, not at Edmund's position, that space belongs to him this afternoon, but close enough to feel the fire's direct radiation on your face. The heat is immediate and almost aggressive after the corridor's cold, pressing against your cheeks and forehead with a warmth that takes several seconds to modulate from relief to simple comfort. You let it. You give yourself those seconds. In a day structured almost entirely around other people's requirements, the seconds you spend warming your face at the hall fire belong to nobody but you. It is in this position, crouched at the fire's edge, your face warm and your back still cold from the corridor, that you first notice the kitchen boy, the thin one who was blowing on the fire this morning, sitting against the wall near the screen's passage, with both arms wrapped around himself and his head tilted at the angle of someone fighting sleep or fighting something else. You watch him for a moment. He does not look like someone fighting sleep. He looks like someone who has been cold for long enough that the cold has moved from outside to inside, which is a different situation entirely. You have felt this before. The transition point when cold stops being a surface condition and becomes something systemic, when your body's management systems, which have been compensating steadily all day, begin to lose ground. The shivering that starts fine and involuntary and becomes coarser and more consuming. The heaviness in the limbs that is not tiredness, but the body redirecting blood toward the core, away from the hands and feet and face performing its biological triage, with the impersonal efficiency of a system that has its own priorities. You know this feeling. You have been this boy in different winters with different fires at different distances. You stand up and cross to Agnes's domain. What happens next is not dramatic. There is no crisis, no emergency summoning of the household's medical knowledge, no moment of high concern. Agnes looks at what you are describing, looks at the boy across the hall, reaches for the pot that has been sitting near the fire since this morning, and ladles something hot into a cup without being asked twice. This is the entirety of the medical consultation. It is also in practical terms exactly correct. A mainstream historical fact that deserves full-weight hypothermia. The systemic lowering of core body temperature was one of the genuine winter killers in medieval England, and it killed not through dramatic sudden collapse, but through the accumulation of smaller cold exposures in bodies that were already nutritionally depleted, already fatigued, already operating without the reserves that adequate food and adequate rest would have provided. The medieval body in January was often a body running on reduced margins, a servant who had been cold all day, who had eaten one bowl of pottage since morning, whose sleeping arrangements provided minimal thermal recovery overnight, was a body whose reserves were narrower than they appeared. The cold did not need to be extreme to find the gap. It needed only to be consistent. You carry the cup to the boy and hand it to him without ceremony, because ceremony would embarrass him, and embarrassment serves no one this afternoon. He takes it with both hands, the same gesture Edmund used this morning, the instinctive cup-as-warming stone response that requires no instruction, and drinks it with the focused attention of someone whose body has recognized what it needs before his mind has fully articulated the request. The drink is hot water rendered slightly substantial by the herbs Agnes keeps above the hearth, sweetened with a scrape of honey from the kitchen's winter store. It is not medicine in any sophisticated sense. It is hot liquid internally administered, delivering warmth directly to the core by the most efficient route available. The effect is visible within minutes, not a transformation, not a cure, but a stabilization. The fine shivering diminishes. The arms loosen slightly from their self-embrace. The colour in his face, which had gone to the particular grey-white of someone whose circulation has retreated from the skin, begins its cautious return, a curious detail from medieval household management that illuminates this moment. Some surviving estate accounts from large English households include a category of expenditure described as remedies for sick servants listed alongside other routine household costs with the same matter-of-fact accounting that covers firewood and candles and salt. The inclusion is interesting not for what it says about generosity, the amounts are small, the remedies basic, but for what it says about practical logic. A servant who is incapacitated by illness or cold cannot work. The cost of a basic remedy is lower than the cost of lost labour. Medieval household management understood this calculation and made it consistently, which means that the care extended to sick servants, while real was also rational. Kindness and pragmatism occupied the same action. Agnes checks on the boy twice in the following hour, both times in passing, both times without stopping long enough to suggest she's checking on him. She adjusts the pot's position near the fire on her second pass, pushing it slightly closer to the heat, which increases the temperature of its contents by a degree or two, and happens to benefit the boy sitting 3 feet away. Whether this is intentional or incidental is a question her expression does not answer. Outside, the afternoon is doing what January afternoons do, contracting rapidly toward dark, the pale light that passed for noon, already fading toward the deeper grey of approaching evening, the temperature falling with the sun's retreat toward the horizon. You can feel the shift even inside the hall, the air cooling noticeably from its afternoon holding pattern toward the night's more serious cold. The fire, which Thomas will need to build higher for the evening, is performing its steady intermediate burn, its warmth reaching perhaps 4 meters in every direction before the hall's volume defeats it. You sit for a moment beside the boy, not from any particular intention, but because the fire is here, and the corridor is cold, and the afternoon has earned you a moment of stillness before the evening's tasks begin their demands. He glances at you sidelong with the expression of someone who is not sure whether gratitude is the appropriate response to a situation he did not ask to be in. You say nothing. You look at the fire. He looks at the fire. The cup steams gently between his hands. His colour is almost normal now, not the robust colour of summer health, but the ordinary winter pallor of a functioning person, rather than the dangerous grey of a person who has lost the margin. Around you the hall breathes its afternoon breath. Wood smoke, damp wool, the faint sweetness of Agnes's herbs, the dog near Edmund's feet exhaling warmth into the rushes. The cold presses against the shuttered windows with its usual persistence, finding gaps, testing edges, doing what cold does with the patient thoroughness of something that has never needed to hurry, because it has always had enough time. But inside this circle of fire and shared warmth, the afternoon holds. The boy finishes his cup, sets it down, looks at his hands as though reacquainting himself with them after a brief absence. Then he stands up because there is work to do, and the work does not pause for cold. Neither do you. The day has reached its midpoint, or what passes for midpoint in January, a brief pale brightening of the sky that constitutes noon, the sun making its lowest arc across the southern horizon, before beginning its retreat almost immediately as though embarrassed by how little warmth it has managed to deliver. The great hall has been swept, the morning's water has been carried, Edmund has been settled near the fire with his remedy and his blanket, and the household has eaten its midday meal. Bread salted, pork boiled until the salt retreated to a manageable level, a thin broth that was more memory of vegetables than actual vegetables and ale, that was warm enough to count as therapeutic. The afternoon's work is beginning, and with it comes the task that most directly confronts the medieval servant's relationship with cold, not the cold of corridors or outer wards, not the cold of frozen well handles or iced cobbles, but the cold of wet hands in winter air, which is its own particular category of suffering, and deserves its own particular attention. The night's approach is already visible in the quality of the light that early medieval January darkening, that begins almost as soon as the brief noon brightness has passed, the sky shifting from pale grey to deeper grey to something with blue in it, that is not the blue of hope but the blue of impending dark. By mid-afternoon the torches will need lighting in the corridors. By late afternoon the great hall will be operating primarily by firelight, and by the time the household sits down to its evening meal, the world outside the castle walls will be completely dark, the frost already reforming on the cobbles, the temperature dropping with the swift efficiency of a winter night that has been waiting all day for its opportunity. The preparation for night in a medieval castle begins counterintuitively in the middle of the afternoon, because the tasks required to make the night survivable are numerous, and time-consuming enough that starting them at dusk would mean finishing them in full dark, which compounds every difficulty. Your afternoon is structured around this logic. The fires must be built up, the torches must be prepared and positioned, the warming stones must be heated and delivered, the beds must be prepared, with whatever thermal resources the household possesses, and all of this must be accomplished while the light still permits it, which means beginning now, while the pale afternoon is still offering something. The bedding first. In the Lord's Solar, the bed a substantial wooden frame with a rope lattice supporting a straw mattress, topped with a wool-stuffed mattress covered with linen sheets and wool blankets. And in winter, a fur coverlet that represents a significant portion of the household's portable wealth requires specific preparation. The fur coverlet has spent the day folded in the chest at the foot of the bed, and it needs to be shaken checked for the moths that are always a theoretical concern and laid across the bed with the fur side down against the upper blanket, creating a surface that will trap the body's warmth from above while the mattresses do the same from below. The warming stones, 2 of them, the large flat-bottomed ones that Agnes keeps specifically for this purpose, are already in the kitchen fire heating since early afternoon, and will be retrieved and wrapped in thick cloth and placed between the sheets approximately 1 hour before the Lord retires, giving them time to warm the bed's interior, without cooling to uselessness before they are needed. A mainstream historical fact about medieval sleeping that tends to reframe the modern imagination. The medieval bed, for those who had a proper one, was an enormously significant object, not merely a piece of furniture, but a technology of warmth, a carefully engineered system of layers designed to maintain the sleeper's body temperature through a night that could drop well below freezing in the room around them. The canopy and curtains that surrounded a wealthy person's bed were not decorative in origin, they were thermal. They created a small enclosed microclimate within the larger cold room, trapping the body's heat, and the warming stone's residual warmth within a fabric envelope that maintained a temperature several degrees higher than the surrounding air. A person sleeping in a properly curtained and warmed medieval bed in a room where their breath fogged the air was not necessarily uncomfortable. They were inside their own small, warm world, sewn shut against the January that pressed against the other side of the curtain. You are not sleeping in that bed, but you are preparing it, which gives you an intimate knowledge of its engineering and a relationship with its warmth that is professional rather than personal. You tuck the fur coverlet with the precision of someone who knows. It will be inspected, smooth the linen with hands that are currently too cold to fully appreciate the fabric's relative softness, and position the curtains so they will close easily later without requiring the body servant to fumble with them in the dark. Then the torches. The castle's corridor lighting in winter is a matter of serious practical management. Torches, bundles of reeds or wooden staves soaked in tallow or pine resin, burn for a limited time and require replacement through the night's long hours. The positioning of torch brackets in the castle's corridors was not random. It was the result of accumulated experience about where light was most needed, where dark was most dangerous, where the combination of cold and poor visibility created the highest risk of the accidents that were a constant background hazard of medieval indoor life. A servant carrying a full water bucket who misjudged a step in a dark corridor could mean an injury. Lost water, a wet floor that would freeze overnight, and a cascade of consequences that extended far beyond the moment of the stumble. A curious detail worth noting: the smell of a medieval castle corridor in winter, with its tallow torches burning and its cold stone, and its accumulated atmosphere of smoke and wool and damp rush, is something that no modern environment quite replicates. Several historians who have worked with reconstructed medieval environments report that the olfactory experience is one of the most disorienting aspects, not unpleasant exactly, but profoundly different from anything modern life prepares you for. The tallow smoke is sweet and faintly animal. The cold stone has its own mineralic quality. The rushes underfoot release a dry, grassy scent that is almost pleasant. And underneath everything, the smell of many people living in close proximity, in a space without modern ventilation, which is simply the smell of humanity, before it learned to hide itself from itself. You move through this smell now as you light the afternoon torches, a taper in your hand, touching flame to each wick in turn, and watching the light bloom in the corridor's darkness. Each torch catches with a small sound, a soft whomp of combustion, a brief brightening, and the corridor lightens incrementally, shadows, retreating to corners, the stone walls becoming visible rather than implied. The light is warm in colour even when the air around it is not. This is something you notice without analysing it. The way torchlight on stone produces an orange-gold quality that reads to the human eye as warmth, even in a corridor where your breath is still visible. The brain confronted with firelight responds as though warmth is present. Medieval people did not know the neuroscience of this. They simply built their lives around fire's light as well as its heat, understanding intuitively that the two were not entirely separable, that light in the dark months was a form of warmth for the spirit even when it failed to warm the body. The last torch catches. The corridor glows its imperfect orange glow from one end to the other. Shadows softened the stone less severe than it was a minute ago. You stand for a moment, taper still burning in your hand, and look down its length. The night is coming. It has been coming since noon, but the torches are lit, the fires are building, the warming stones are heating in the kitchen, and the castle is making its nightly preparations with the practiced efficiency of a household that has survived many winters and intends to survive this one. You cup your hand around the taper's flame as you walk back toward the kitchen, protecting it from the corridor's draught, with the automatic care of someone who understands that small flames, like small warmths, require protection to persist. The night will come regardless, but it will find the castle ready. The evening has fully arrived. Not the tentative early evening of an hour ago when the light outside was merely failing. This is the complete evening, the one with no qualification, the dark that medieval people understood not as the absence of day, but as a different category of existence entirely. The torches are burning in the corridor brackets. The hall fire has been built to its evening height by Thomas, who performed this task with the focused ceremony of someone who understands that what he is doing is not merely adding wood to a fire, but establishing the night's thermal baseline setting, the conditions under which 30 people will attempt to survive the next several hours in reasonable comfort. The household has eaten, the bowls have been cleared, Edmund is in his position near the fire looking better than this morning, which is a small victory that everyone has noticed and nobody has mentioned, because in this world good news is held quietly like a warming stone inside your shirt, close to the chest where the cold cannot reach it. You are in your place in the hall's middle distance, not the innermost ring, not the outer cold, but the negotiated middle territory that is yours by the unwritten law of long habitation. The rushes beneath you are dry tonight, which is not always the case, and this small fact registers as a genuine comfort. Dry rushes insulate better than damp ones. Dry rushes smell of grass, rather than of the things that damp rushes smell of. You have learned to notice these distinctions because in a life where the large comforts are largely unavailable, the small ones bear the full weight of the word. The hall is quieting. Not silent, it will not be silent for another hour, while the last conversations finish and the final movements of the evening settle into stillness. But the noise level has dropped from the clatter of the meal to something lower and more varied, a murmur of voices, the occasional dog shift, the fire's steady commentary of crackle and breath. This is the hour you have been moving toward all day without quite realizing it. The hour when the day's demands release their grip, when the body begins its negotiation with sleep, when the mind, no longer needed for tasks, does what minds do in the dark. It tells stories. Not deliberately, not with the performed structure of an entertainer working a room. These are the stories that simply begin passed from one person to another, with the organic ease of things that have been told before and will be told again, stories that belong to this particular hall, and this particular winter, and the particular darkness pressing against these particular shutters tonight. You have heard most of them. Hearing them again is not tedious. Hearing them again is the point. The story that begins tonight starts with a sound. Someone, the young groom, the one with the unresolved relationship to fear that manifests as compulsive storytelling after dark, cocks his head toward the eastern wall and says quietly enough to be heard by the people nearest to him and nobody else. There it is again. Nobody asks what. Everybody knows what. The sound the castle makes in deep cold, the low, resonant groan of stone contracting, of ancient mortar responding to temperature, with the reluctant movement of something very old being asked to change, has been present all evening. But there is a particular note in it tonight, a quality that sits just at the edge of the range where stone sound becomes something else, where the rational explanation is entirely available and somehow not entirely sufficient. You feel it too. Not fear exactly, you have lived in this castle long enough to know its winter vocabulary, to recognise the stone settling sounds and the wind finding gap sounds, and the timber shrinking sounds, to have catalogued them across sufficient winters that they rarely surprise you anymore. But there is a part of you that catalogued them in the first place, because they needed cataloguing, because the mind confronted with darkness and cold, an unexplained sound reaches instinctively for explanation, and when explanation is not immediately available, it reaches for something older. The groom tells the story of the well. You have heard this one. Everyone in the hall has heard this one. It belongs to this castle, the way the tapestries belong to the walls, an inherited fixture whose origins nobody can quite trace, and whose details shift slightly with each telling without the core ever changing. A servant went to the well alone after dark, in December. The specific December is always last December, or 3 Decembers ago, or some other December, recent enough to feel real and distant enough to be unverifiable. The servant came back changed. Not dramatically, this is important to the story's effectiveness that the change is subtle, that it is the kind of change you could almost explain away. He was cold in a way that fire could not address. He stopped sleeping in the way that people sleep. He stopped eating in the way that people eat. By February he was gone, and the nature of his going was described with a vagueness that was more frightening than specificity would have been. Silence in the hall when the story finishes. The quality of silence that follows a story which has landed correctly, not the silence of disbelief, but the silence of recognition of people privately auditing, their own proximity to the fire, their own plans for the hours ahead. A mainstream historical fact that grounds these stories in something real. Historians studying medieval English popular belief have documented extensively the way winter darkness generated a specific category of supernatural anxiety that was distinct from general religious fear and distinct from summer's supernatural concerns. Winter's long nights, its isolation, its genuine physical danger produced beliefs about what moved through the dark that were specific to the season. The wild hunt, a host of supernatural riders crossing the winter sky on the darkest nights, appears in sources across northern Europe with enough consistency to constitute a genuine cultural phenomenon, not an isolated eccentricity. The belief that certain places became dangerous after dark in winter, that wells and crossroads and thresholds carried a different quality of risk in January than in June, appears in enough medieval English sources to suggest widespread acceptance, rather than fringe superstition. You know the difference between stone settling and something else. You have always known this difference in the part of your mind that manages rational daily function, but you are also a person who lives in 1280, which means you are a person for whom the membrane between the explicable and the inexplicable is thinner than it will later become for whom the world contains genuine mysteries that no available framework fully accounts for whom the darkness outside this hall is not merely the absence of light, but a space in which things you cannot name have always been understood to move. A curious detail that folklore historians find quietly significant, the specific medieval English belief that naming dangerous supernatural entities aloud after dark could summon or attract them, produced a behavioural habit of speaking about them indirectly, sideways, using descriptions rather than names. The old ones, the ones that ride, the thing at the well. This oblique language appears in enough medieval and early modern sources to constitute a genuine speech pattern rather than literary convention. Language in this worldview was not merely descriptive. It reached, words found their subjects, and some subjects were better left unfound. Someone adds a log to the fire, the decisiveness of the action, the specific unnecessary vigour of it, given that the fire does not require a log at this precise moment, says everything about why it is being added. The groom has more. He speaks quietly, now pitched for the circle around him, rather than the hall at large, which gives the next story the quality of something confided rather than performed. He describes a night last January when he was in the outer stable after dark, a legitimate errand. He's careful to specify a legitimate errand, and heard coming from the direction of the postern gate a sound that he demonstrates now with a brief soft vocalization that makes the nearest dog lift its head sharply and hold it there, ears forward, staring at the eastern wall. The dog's reaction produces a ripple of profound unease around the fire circle. Nobody looks at the dog. Everyone looks at the eastern wall. You breathe slowly, deliberately, the way you have learned to breathe in the dark when the cold and the stories and the castle's own voice are combining into something that requires a conscious response. You are not afraid. You are choosing not to be afraid, which is a different thing, and the choice requires a small, ongoing effort that the fire's warmth makes possible. The groom finishes. The hall holds its breath for a moment, that collective pause of people who have been somewhere together and are now returning. Then Agnes, from her position near the kitchen passage, makes a sound that is not quite a word, and not quite a laugh, but occupies the space between them with the authority of someone who has heard every version of every story told in this hall for 20 winters, and has her own relationship with the dark that does not require either belief or dismissal. The tension releases. Slowly, like cold air from a room where someone has finally opened a window, people settle. The fire resumes its authority. Thomas adds the necessary log, the right log, the needed one placed with the precision of someone who was waiting for the room to come back to itself before drawing attention to the hearth. You pull your wool wrap closer and look at the fire and let its light do what firelight does to the human mind, calm it. Slow, it reduced the large, formless fears to something contained and warm-edged, something that the next section of darkness will require courage to face, but that this section of firelight makes manageable. Outside, the wind moves through the upper stonework with a sound that is entirely explicable. You listen to it anyway, the way you always listen, the way everyone in this hall always listens, just to be sure. The fire has settled into its evening rhythm, steady. Generous its flames, no longer the ambitious climbing fire of morning, but the mature, reliable burn of a hearth that has found its pace and intends to keep it. The hall is filled for the evening meal the household gathered at its various tables in the order that medieval life requires, and the noise level has risen to something approaching warmth in itself. Voices the clatter of wooden bowls, the dogs repositioning themselves with hopeful optimism near the tables where food is being consumed. Edmund is still near the fire, his bowl held in both hands, eating slowly. Thomas has eaten quickly the way children eat when they are genuinely hungry, and is already positioned near the hearth, with the focused attention of someone who has remembered his responsibilities. The evening, for all its cold and all its darkness pressing against the shutters, has a quality of gathering of people, and warmth and noise collected into one room against the night outside. But not everyone in this hall is equally gathered. Not everyone in this hall is equally present to the evening's relative comfort, and this is the section of the day, the hour between the evening meal and the full settling into sleep, when winter reveals most clearly who it has been working on quietly, patiently at the margins throughout the preceding weeks. The children are the first category. There are 4 of them in the servant household, not the Lord's children who are upstairs in their nurse's care with their own fire and their own thermal arrangements, but the children of servants, the ones whose parents work in this castle, and whose presence here is a negotiated reality of employing people who are also human beings with families. The youngest is perhaps 3, a girl whose mother works in the kitchen, and who spends her days in a wooden box near the kitchen hearth. Not cruelty, but engineering a contained warm space that keeps a small child safe and warm while her mother works. The oldest is perhaps 9, already useful enough to have assigned tasks, already old enough to understand the castle's hierarchy of cold, and to have found her position within it. Children in medieval winter were vulnerable in ways that the period understood and largely accepted, with the grim pragmatism of people who had no alternative framework. Infant and child mortality in winter months was measurably higher than in other seasons, driven by the combination of respiratory infections that move through, close-quartered households, nutritional deficiencies that accumulated as winter lengthened and food variety narrowed, and the simple thermal reality that a small body loses heat faster than a large one, and requires proportionally more external warmth to maintain its core temperature. A child who was adequately warm and adequately fed was likely to survive the winter. A child who was cold and inadequately nourished was at genuine risk. Medieval parents understood this with the directness that modern sensibility finds uncomfortable, and medieval necessity found simply true. The 3-year-old near the kitchen fire has been coughing since last week. Agnes has given her mother a remedy, honey and time warm, administered 3 times daily, and the mother administers it with the focused attention of someone performing a ritual against a force she cannot directly fight. The cough has not worsened. It has not improved. It is simply present, a small wet sound in the kitchen's warm air, a reminder that winter does not observe exemptions for size or innocence. A mainstream historical fact that provides necessary context. Historians studying medieval childhood mortality have noted that medieval parents were not emotionally detached from their children's welfare, despite a persistent popular myth suggesting otherwise. The argument that high child mortality produced emotional distance as a protective mechanism has been largely challenged by medievalists examining wills, letters chronicles, and legal records which consistently demonstrate parental grief, parental investment, and parental anxiety about children's health and survival that is entirely recognizable from a modern perspective. The mother checking on her daughter between kitchen tasks, adjusting the box closer to the fire, pausing to feel the child's forehead with the spack of her hand. This is not a medieval behaviour, it is a human one. The elderly are the second category. Edmund, whom you watched this morning, is the most visible example in this household, but he is not the only one. there is a woman who works in the laundry, grey-haired compact, with hands so permanently red from cold water that their colour seems constitutional rather than environmental, who has been moving more slowly since Christmas. Not dramatically slowly, not the slowness of someone who is visibly failing, the slowness of someone whose body is conducting a quiet negotiation with the cold about what it is still willing to do, and whose body is beginning gradually to lose that negotiation. A curious detail from medieval household accounts that illuminates this dynamic. In some larger establishments, the records show a category of expenditure described as board for aged servants, a provision for individuals who had passed the age of useful labour, but remained in the household in a dependent capacity, fed and housed in exchange for their long service. This appears matter-of-factly in the accounts alongside other routine expenses, which suggests it was understood as a normal obligation rather than an extraordinary generosity. The medieval household at its functional best operated on a logic of mutual dependency that included provision for those who could no longer contribute at full capacity. Whether this ideal was consistently achieved is another matter, but its presence in the accounts suggests it was at least aspired to. You watch the laundrywoman eat her evening meal. She is seated closer to the fire than her usual position, which she has not been given. She has simply moved there with the quiet authority of someone who has been in this household long enough to know which conventions are negotiable. Nobody has said anything. This is the same silent social adjustment you observed with Edmund this morning, the household, recalibrating its rules of proximity for people whose need exceeds their rank. It is not policy. It is not charity in any formal sense. It is simply the way communities of people who live together through winters learn to see each other. There is still debate among historians about the degree to which medieval servant communities operated as genuine mutual support networks, or whether the apparent solidarity was primarily a function of close quarters and shared circumstance rather than genuine affection or organised care. Some researchers point to evidence of servants leaving small bequests to fellow workers in their wills of workplace friendships, maintained across household changes of the specific language of brotherhood and fellowship that appears in guild records and occasionally in household accounts. Others argue these are exceptional cases, and that the default was the social atomization of a hierarchical system that discouraged horizontal solidarity. What the debate tends to undervalue is the evidence of small daily acts, the extra log placed on Edmund's side of the fire, the laundrywoman's uncontested move closer to the hearth, the mother's remedy from Agnes's hands. These are not recorded in chronicles. They are not preserved in accounts. They left no documentary trace because they were too ordinary, too daily, too much the texture of life rather than its punctuation. But they happened. They happen in every community of people living in close quarters under difficult conditions, because human beings placed in circumstances where survival requires attention to one another tend to pay that attention. The 3-year-old has stopped coughing for the moment. She's asleep in her box near the kitchen fire, her small chest rising and falling, with the steady rhythm of a child who is at this particular moment warm and fed and safe. Her mother passes the doorway, glances in, and continues with her work. The glance lasts perhaps 2 seconds. It carries everything. Outside, the frost is deepening. The stars have appeared brilliant cold, indifferent in the gaps between clouds. The temperature is dropping with the night's full commitment, the day's marginal warmth surrendering completely to the dark. Inside, the fire burns. The old and the young press closer to it. And the household, without announcement or ceremony, arranges itself around its most vulnerable members with the quiet competence of people who have been doing this long enough to do it without thinking. Winter hunts the margins. The margins hold together, and for tonight that is sufficient. The evening meal is finished. The bowls have been collected, the trestle tables folded against the wall, the dogs settled into their positions near the hearth, with the satisfied heaviness of animals whose evening has gone according to plan. The hall is quieter now, the noise of eating replaced by the lower, more varied sounds of a household in its transitional hour, the murmur of conversation, the occasional cough, the soft percussion of someone mending by firelight, the distant sound of wind finding the castle's upper stonework and making its nightly commentary on the inadequacy of medieval insulation. This is the hour when the day releases its grip on you, when the body begins its slow negotiation with sleep, and when the mind, freed from the immediate demands of tasks, wanders where it will. Your mind tonight goes to the voices, not the voices around you in the hall. Those are present and immediate and require no effort to hear. The voices you are thinking about are older, more distant, preserved. in the unlikely medium of written records that most of the people in this room could not read and did not know existed. Chronicles, household accounts, monastic records. The occasional letter, these are the places where the medieval cold left its documentary trace, where real people, most of them long dead, described in their own words what winter actually felt like from the inside. The monk Matthew Paris, writing in his chronicle at St Albans in the 13th century, describes a winter of particular severity, with an attention to physical detail that is startling in its immediacy. He writes of rivers frozen solid enough to bear the weight of carts of birds falling dead from trees, of the poor dying in the streets of London despite the efforts of charitable citizens. His language is formal, his framework theological. The severe winter is understood as divine judgment or divine test, filtered through the interpretive lens that was the only lens available to a learned man of his period. But underneath the theology is something direct and human. A man who was cold, who watched people suffer from cold, and who wanted the record to reflect that this had happened, that it had been real, that the winter of that particular year had been genuinely terrible. A curious detail from monastic records that bridges the documentary and the physical. Several surviving manuscripts from English monasteries show evidence of what paleographers call cold weather hands, the distinctive changes in handwriting that occur when the person holding the quill is working in temperatures low enough to affect fine motor control. The letters become larger, less controlled, the careful calligraphic discipline of the scriptorium, giving way to something rawer and more effortful. Some manuscripts show ink that has thickened in the cold, producing lines of varying width that reflect the ink's reluctance to flow, rather than the scribe's intention. These manuscripts are in a very literal sense the cold made visible, physical evidence of a human being sitting in a freezing room trying to do precise work with hands that the temperature was working against. You think about those hands tonight. The monk sitting in his scriptorium in January, breath-fogging the parchment fingers numb around the quill, writing with dogged persistence about whatever the day's assigned text required theology, history, the lives of saints, while the cold made every letter an act of minor determination. You have never held a quill. You will never write anything that survives. But you understand the cold he was writing in because you are sitting in its direct descendant right now, and the understanding requires no translation. The peasant voices are harder to find because peasants did not generally write, and the records that mention them were created by people whose interest in their inner lives was limited. But they appear fragmentarily in court records, the depositions of witnesses in legal cases where ordinary people's words were transcribed by clerks with varying degrees of accuracy and interest. A court record from Norfolk dating to the late 13th century contains the testimony of a farm labourer describing his whereabouts on a particular winter night. He was, he says, at home. He could not have been elsewhere because the cold that night was such that no man would choose to be outside it who had any choice. The clerk recorded this without comment. It was simply a fact unremarkable, requiring no elaboration. A mainstream historical fact that deserves full recognition. The historical record of medieval common people's experience is fragmentarily preserved, precisely because the systems that created documentary records were not designed to capture ordinary experience. Manorial accounts recorded quantities of grain and livestock, not the conditions of the people handling them. Church records documented baptisms, marriages, and deaths, not the quality of the winters that preceded them. Legal records captured disputes and crimes, not the texture of daily survival. The cold that Edmund and Agnes and Thomas, and the laundry woman and the 3-year-old in her box near the kitchen fire are experiencing tonight will leave almost no documentary trace. The historian who looks for them in the archives will find the lord's name, the estate's value, the quantities of firewood purchased. The servants will be implied if they are present at all. But there is a letter. Not from this castle, not from this year, but from a household servant in a great English house, written sometime in the late 14th century, preserved in a collection of family papers with the randomness that governs archival survival. The servant is writing to a relative, a sister possibly, or a cousin, and the letter is primarily practical, concerned with a request for a specific item to be sent. But it opens with a description of the winter that has the quality of something said, because it needed saying, because the season had reached a point where acknowledgement was necessary. She writes that the cold this year has been very great, and that they have felt it much in the house, particularly in the upper rooms where the fires have been insufficient, and that she has not been warm since October, except in the kitchen and in her bed, and that she looks forward to March with a feeling she cannot quite name, but which has to do with the return of something she has missed. The feeling she cannot quite name. You know this feeling. You are sitting in it right now in the hall's firelit warmth with the January dark pressing against the shutters and the winter's remaining weeks spread out before you, like a distance still to be crossed. It is not despair. Despair requires a belief that the end will not come, and you know the end will come because it always comes, because spring is as reliable as cold, because the world has never yet failed to turn. It is not exactly longing, though. Longing is part of it. It is something more specific than either the feeling of a person who is enduring something difficult and is aware of enduring it, who can see the end in the abstract, even if not in the immediate, and who is holding that abstract knowledge like a warming stone against the present cold. The servant who wrote that letter did not know her words would survive 7 centuries. She was writing to her sister about a specific item she needed, and the winter was simply the context she was living in mentioned, because it was the largest fact of her current existence, and therefore the natural beginning of any communication. She looked forward to March. She got there. The letter is evidence. You will get there too. The fire burns steadily. The hall breathes around you 30 lives in various stages of approaching sleep. Edmund's chest rises and falls with a steadiness that is slightly better than this morning, which is enough. The 3-year-old is asleep in her box. Thomas is at the hearth, watchful, doing his job. Outside, the stars are extraordinary, the cold air having stripped away every particle of moisture and haze, leaving a sky of absolute clarity that would be beautiful if you were in a position to appreciate beauty, which requires a warmth you currently do not have. But the voices are there across the centuries: monks with cold hands, farm labourers in Norfolk courts, a servant woman writing to her sister about March. They all felt this. They all sat in this dark and this cold, holding this same feeling with no better name for it than she had. They endured, they wrote, they waited for March, and March came. The hall is quieting now. Not all at once quiet in a medieval great hall arrives, the way winter itself arrives, gradually imperceptibly 1 degree of stillness at a time, until you look around and realise that most of the movement has stopped, and most of the voices have folded into the general silence that belongs to the deep evening. The dogs are still. The fire has settled into its banked configuration, Thomas having performed his nightly ritual with the careful precision you watched him develop over 2 winters, the coals gathered and the ash laid over them with the deliberate patience of someone who understands exactly what is at stake. The torches in the corridor outside have burned to their lower thirds. The wind has dropped or retreated or simply exhausted itself against the castle's indifferent stonework and moved on to easier targets. You are preparing for sleep. This is not a simple act in the world of 1280. It is a sequence, a ritual almost, with its own order and its own requirements, shaped by the cold that governs every other aspect of your existence, and that does not suspend its governance simply because the day is ending. Sleep in winter is not a retreat from cold. It is a negotiation with it, conducted horizontally under whatever layers you can assemble in whatever space the hall's sleeping arrangements assign to you. Your sleeping place is in the hall's middle zone, not the innermost ring nearest the fire, which belongs to the senior household servants and the hounds who have successfully argued their case for proximity through years of persistence, and not the outermost positions near the walls, where the cold radiation from the stone is most direct and most relentless. The middle zone is compromised territory, which is to say it is the territory of people like you, important enough to be inside, not important enough to be warm. You have occupied this position long enough that it no longer strikes you as unfair. It simply is. The castle has a temperature gradient, and you are in the middle of it, and this is Tuesday. The warming stone is the first preparation. Yours is smaller than the Lord's. The household's allocation of dense heat-retaining stones operates on the same hierarchical logic as everything else, but it has been in the kitchen fire since mid-afternoon, and it is when you retrieve it wrapped in its cloth genuinely hot against your palms. You carry it to your sleeping place and slide it under the rough wool blanket that constitutes your primary bedding, positioning it where your feet will be. The blanket is already slightly warmer from the hall's general heat. The stone's addition raises the temperature of the small enclosed space beneath it to something that will within the hour feel almost welcoming. The undressing is rapid and strategic. You do not remove everything. This is not false modesty. Nobody in the Great Hall is under any illusions about what human bodies look like, and privacy in this world is a concept applied selectively and practically rather than comprehensively. You remove the outer layers, the belt, the overgown, the wool wrap around your hands. You keep the linen under tunic and the wool hose. You keep your feet wrapped. You have learned through the direct education of several winters that the body's overnight heat retention is substantially improved by keeping the extremities covered even in sleep, and that the slight discomfort of sleeping in partial dress is nothing compared to waking at 3 a.m. with feet that have lost sensation and a body that has spent several hours losing the warmth it spent the day accumulating. A mainstream historical fact that validates this instinct. Historians studying medieval sleep practices through both documentary and material evidence have confirmed that sleeping fully or partially clothed in winter was standard practice across all social levels, with the degree of undressing varying by the quality of the bedding available. The lord in his curtained bed with his fur coverlet and his warming stones could afford to sleep in his linen, alone the bed's microclimate maintaining sufficient temperature. The servant in the hall with a wool blanket and a cooling stone slept in his working clothes because the alternative was simply colder. The body was not wrong, it was rational. You settle onto the rushes, pulling the blanket over you, feeling the warming stone's heat rise through the cloth against your feet. The relief is immediate and disproportionate, the simple fact of warmth against cold feet, producing a physical gratitude that is one of the most honest sensations available in this life. You have felt this every night of every winter you can remember, and it has never become ordinary. Some small recognitions remain fresh regardless of repetition. This is one of them. Around you the hall settles into its breathing. 30 people in various stages of sleep, their combined respiration producing a faint collective sound, not snoring, not quite, but something more diffuse and oceanic, the sound of a room full of resting bodies, their warmth contributing to the air, their stillness contributing to the quiet. The fire's glow pulses faintly against the ceiling orange, and slow the banked coals doing their careful overnight work. The dog shift sighs settle again with the luxurious finality of animals for whom sleep presents no complications, a curious detail that historians of medieval daily life find quietly remarkable. The concept of sleep in the medieval period was different from the modern understanding in at least one significant way. Medieval people commonly experienced what researchers now call segmented sleep, a first sleep of several hours, followed by a period of wakefulness lasting an hour or more, followed by a second sleep until morning. This pattern, which modern sleep science recognizes as the natural human sleep cycle in the absence of artificial light, was so normal in the medieval world that it was simply unremarked upon. People used the waking interval between sleeps for prayer, for quiet conversation, for tasks that required minimal light, for the kind of thinking that the full silence of a sleeping household permits. Thomas used it to check the fire. Edmund used it on good nights to sit near the hearth in the interval's quiet and breathe the warmer air near the coals. You use it on the nights when the cold wakes you cleanly, rather than through discomfort to simply lie still in the dark and listen to the hall breathe around you. Tonight you are not there yet. Tonight you are in the first sleep's approach, that slow dissolving of the day's accumulated tensions into the gradual heaviness of genuine rest. The warming stone is doing its work. The blanket has trapped enough of your body's heat to create a zone of survivable warmth that extends perhaps 30 centimeters in every direction from where you lie. The cold outside that zone is present. You are aware of it the way you are aware of the stone floor beneath the rushes as a background fact rather than an immediate threat. The fire pulses. The wind is distant tonight, whatever it found to do elsewhere apparently sufficient to occupy it. The castle is as quiet as it gets, which is not fully quiet. Stone buildings in cold weather speak in creaks and low groans, the sound of materials contracting of ancient mortar, responding to temperature with the slow, reluctant movement of something very old being asked to change. You have stopped hearing these sounds as sounds. They are simply the castle's breathing, as familiar as the people around you, as unremarkable as the cold itself. Your mind begins its nightly drift. The images of the day pass through in no particular order. The well's frozen surface, Edmund's cup of remedy. The tapestry's cold back pressed against the wall. Thomas's face lit orange by the rebuilt fire. The smoke rising from the village rooftops in the pale morning air. The horses breathing in patient clouds in the stable's relative warmth. Agnes's hands, moving with their automatic authority over the morning's pottage. These images do not demand anything from you. They are simply the day releasing itself, becoming memory-making room for the dark. You think briefly of spring, not with longing, not tonight. Tonight you are too tired for longing, which requires a kind of energy that the day has fully consumed. You think of it simply as a fact, distant but reliable, the way you think of morning when you go to sleep at night. It will come. The cold will loosen. The frost will retreat from the cobbles and the well and the stone walls and the inside of the shuttered windows. The birds will return to the eaves. The fields below the castle will soften from iron grey to something with colour in it. Agnes will begin using fresh herbs again. Edmund's chest will improve in the warmer air. The 3-year-old will stop coughing. You do not need spring tonight. Tonight you have the warming stone and the banked fire and the breathing hall and the wool blanket and the 30 people around you, contributing their quiet warmth to the air you share. Tonight these things are enough. Tonight these things are in the precise meaning of the word that Agnes would appreciate sufficient. Not luxurious, not comfortable by any standard that history will later develop, but sufficient, adequate to survival, equal to the cold. The fire dims another degree. Thomas's eyes are heavy but open, performing their faithful watch. The hall holds its warmth as best it can against the January dark pressing at every gap and shutter. And you drift, not away from anything, towards something, the quiet that waits on the other side of a wakefulness, the warmth that the body makes for itself when the day finally releases it, the rest that belongs to people who have carried water and lit fires and swept floors and tended the sick and endured the cold and done all the invisible things that keep a household alive through a winter, that history will not record and that you will not remember as exceptional, because it was simply the winter, the same as last year's, the same as next year's, the ordinary, extraordinary fact of surviving together in a cold stone building at the edge of a frozen world. The stone is warm against your feet. The hall breathes. The fire holds. Sleep when it comes gently the way spring comes, without announcement, simply present one morning where it was not the night before. Rest now as they once did. The long night has begun, and you are ready for it. Sweet dreams.